7 o'clock. I'd like to call the Charter of Township of Buren, the BZA meeting for a roll call, please.
Pledge of allegiance first.
Oh, first, I'm going, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm gonna check them.
Please rise and raise your right hand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, with the republic. First of all, I would like to thank everybody in the audience for coming this evening. It was dry and clear, so it wasn't a bad night to get out into the weather here. And with this, I would like to get our recording secretary to do the roll call, please.
Thank you. John Herman,
Here.
Amos Grissett,
Here.
Kevin Martin,
Here.
John Clark,
Present.
Aaron Sellers,
Here.
Jeff Jar,
Here.
Charles LaRock,
Absent and excused.
and Brian Cohen.
He is in the
In the audience. Ryan is in the audience.
Yep.
We have a quorum. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is acceptance of the agenda. If anybody has any additions or deletions or any corrections, let me know. If not, the motion to approve the agenda is in order.
I would like to make a motion to approve tonight's agenda.
After support? Yes. The move and second. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed likewise. Motion carried. Thank you. The staff or anybody have any correspondence?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we did receive some correspondence regarding an item that's on the agenda tonight, the case 22-056. I have forwarded that correspondence to the BZA in the form of a link to a live document that includes those comments. So I'm glad to pull those comments up as needed and summarize them later in the meeting, but the BZA has received those correspondences from Mr. Riggs and Ms. Walsh for tonight's meeting, and the previous correspondences on that case as well.
Yes, we have received them. I have a set of extra copies in case anybody hasn't seen them. They were online today. If not, I can share these, but somebody if they need to have them. So, one housekeeping item, please. Please put your cell phones on mute or vibrate. Everybody, please. We don't need to interrupt this meeting. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is public hearing.
Before we get to that, do we have to do the approval of the minutes from last meeting?
Yes, we do. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
The minutes are attached in your package for you to review, and if there's no comments or any corrections or deletions, the motion is in order.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. John.
I move to approve the minutes as submitted.
I second.
The motion then seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, likewise, motion carried. Now we go to new business and public hearing. Case number 25-005- residential height interpretation. The request is for an appeal for the interpretation of the provision of the following section of Henry Township zoning ordinance by the Board of Zoning Appeals on section 12.403B1 of the zoning ordinance and section 3.106D in the R1, R2A, R1A, R2A, R1B, and R1C single family residential district. Dimensional regulations, max building height of 30 feet and max building height story wise 2. The request is for interpretation is as whether the maximum allowed building height is in the R1A, R2A, R1B, and R1Z zoning district is limited to 1 or both height in feet, height in stories. If the maximum building height is limited only by height in feet, the number of stories would not be applicable, so long as the building height does not exceed 30 feet. But with that, the motion is in order to open the public hearing.
I'd like to make a motion to open the public hearing.
There's been motion and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed likewise, and that motion carried. We now have a public hearing. During the public comment section of this hearing, the people in the audience are invited to speak up on this issue only, whether they have concerns or interpretations, or this is open for the public for discussion. However, we do ask you to go up to the podium so the people at home and on Zoom can see and hear your comments, and so we can hear it as well. So with that, if there's any public comment, please come up to the microphone here and state your comments so we can consider your comments on this proposal. Seeing none, anybody wants to speak on this proposed concept? No? Hearing, asking once, asking twice, seeing none, no public comments, motion to close the public hearing is in order. Public hearing.
Second.
It's a good motion and supported.
Sir, discussion.
Discussion? Yes.
Did we get the Zoom meeting? Or any public comment?
Yeah, please correct me when I'm.
Thank you, Board Member Jar. I do have just one attendee on Zoom, and I do not see any indication that they're interested in speaking on this item on the agenda. As a reminder, anybody on Zoom, please either enter into the chat, enter in the Q&A box, or raise your hand, your virtual hand, to make comments, and we'll be glad to take those comments when you're prompted. But this is an opportunity to speak to the residential height interpretation question. And I don't see the hand raised or any comments in the chat, so I think we can close that part of the hearing now.
Okay, thank you.
This addresses my concern. Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you. All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed likewise, public hearing is closed. Thank you. Unfinished business. Case number 22-056, Belleville Yacht Club. The location is a Township Lake property adjacent to 831 East Huron River Drive, and the parcel number is listed. Zone Belleville Lake Shoreline District B, non-single family residential, BLB. Adjacent property, 831 East Huron River Drive, is zoned R1C, single family residential. There's a request in front of us for an exception, modification, or appeal by the Belleville Yacht Club to install 2 dock structures, each with a length not to exceed 85.3 feet, as revised from a previous request to propose the lengths not to exceed 120 feet. Subject to approval by the state of Michigan, in contrast with the proposed requirement of section 3.120 D5 of Van Buren Township zoning ordinance, which limit dock lengths to 40 feet to the Belleville Lake. Measure perpendicularly of the shoreline unless greater length is necessary to reach the water depth of 3 feet. The subject site is located in the Township Lake property adjacent to East Buren River Drive. And again, the parcel number is listed. On the north side of East Buren Drive between Loza Lane and Everwood Lane Court. The site is zoned Belleville Lake Shore District, B, non-single family residential, BLD. The request will be reviewed by the BZA for requirements section 3.120F7 of Van Buren Township zoning laws. At first, we'll have a presentation by the township staff.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you everybody for attending tonight's meeting. I will go over the findings in my report for this stage of the review of this project, being before the BZA tonight, regarding specifically the exception from the 40-foot maximum length in the Van Buren Township zoning ordinance for dock structures. The applicant, BYC, has applied for site plan review and special approval to construct a marina use, including 2 dock structures, each containing a single dock stem with 3 connecting docks. Upon completion, the project is proposed to replace 2 previously existing floating dock structures. Because of the upland parcel's institutional or non-residential use, the site is zoned BLB, or Belleville Lake Shoreline District B, non-single family residential, as the chair had mentioned. And this land use is a permitted use by special approval in the BLB district within the Belleville Lake. The review process for the proposed new docks and marina will require completion of a site plan review in accordance with the requirements of section 3.120 of the Van Buren Township zoning ordinance. And as mentioned, marinas are a use that requires special approval in the BLB district under that ordinance. The proposed use will also involve the construction of 2 multi-dock structures, which have a proposed length of 85.3 feet based on the most recent plan submittal from the applicant, which is reduced from an original submittal that had the dock structures at 120 feet. You can see the dock structures on the screen in front of you. There are also some copies of the plans on the table tonight, and there's also copies or an electronic version of the plans on the website in a couple of different locations. Section 3.120D5 of the Van Buren Township zoning ordinance states that no dock or any other structure or appurtenance shall extend more than 40 feet into the lake. However, there is a process for exception from the rules and regulations of the Van Buren Township's Belleville Lake Shoreline District's ordinance through section 3.120F7 of the Van Buren Township zoning ordinance. So relief from section 3.120D5 is therefore sought with this application before the BZA. The request is building upon a series of other meetings and other reviews that have come before both the BZA and the Planning Commission. So I'd like to give a little bit of background on some of the meetings that have occurred to date. There was a public hearing by this board, BZA, on January 10th of 2023 regarding the exception request. And there was a public hearing by the Planning Commission on January 11th. As previously referenced in the beginning of tonight's meeting, we have received a number of public comments from members of the public. We also have received feedback from the BZA and the Planning Commission. Specific comments have come from individuals including Michelle Montour, Jack Ridnour, Will Howley, Don Stolt, John Hickey, Jeffrey Riggs, Ken Holtz, Kathleen Walsh, and Jeffrey Riggs again, most recently for tonight's meeting. So just to acknowledge some of the comments we received. Again, these comments are on a regularly updated live document on the website, so anybody can review them. To try to summarize the scope of the comments, they range from some comments around the site's boating use, the impacts of the proposed dock lengths on lake navigability, safety and aesthetics, and the uniqueness of the property and its constraints or attributes. At tonight's meeting, The BZA is building upon some other reviews that have occurred, as I mentioned. There were the public hearings for the marina site plan and special approval use by the Planning Commission on January 11th. There was a public hearing by the BZA on January 10th. Following those first two meetings, there was a interim review of a preliminary plan for the Planning Commission to look at a greater detail at the plan and to provide some feedback for the BZA to continue their review process and to help inform their decision. That meeting was held on February 8th. At that meeting, based on the dock plan that was submitted at that time with the two 120-foot long dock structures, there was a statement by the planning commissioner who was providing the summary comments that they did not believe the exception should be granted based on the findings, several of the findings for granting exceptions at that time. The applicant has now submitted a revised plan with a shorter dock length to be considered by the BZA tonight. Following potential action by the BZA, the dock lengths presumably being set by the action by the BZA, that will allow the remaining portions of the site plan and special approval to be considered by the Planning Commission at a later date. To assist the BZA with their analysis tonight, I will note that the applicant has provided a significant amount of detail since the plans that were provided in January. There is a revised two-page site plan submittal from Hardy Civil Design Services that was received by the township, and that's the same set of plans that's on the table tonight. These plans include a number of details that are spelled out in my staff report that are included on a second sheet, or excuse me, a second document after the main report, which would be for the BZA's benefit, starting on page 28 of your BZA packet tonight. So there's a full kind of audit of the submittals. You now have a overall site schematic, a broad view of the docks in relation to some of the surrounding lake contours. And you can see what that looks like, kind of showing the site in context, as well as some significant additional detail on the site plan itself on the first sheet, with dimensions showing the dock lengths, setback distances, dock length distance. I will mention that the side yard setbacks have been increased from 12 feet to 21 feet, and the dock structure lengths have been reduced from 120 feet to 85.3 feet as part of this submittal. I mentioned the exception criteria that the BZA is tasked with using as part of their review for considering any modifications to the Belleville Lake Shoreline District ordinance requirements, including the 40-foot maximum length for docking structures. These should be the guide for the BZA's decision tonight. So I will put those up on the screen briefly here, just to go over them one by one. That the enforcement of the provisions requested for special exception would unnecessarily prevent the reasonable use of the land or boats involved without resulting benefit to the public health, safety, and welfare of persons or property. On that point, I have provided some factors that the BZA may consider when reviewing each of these criteria. For this one, you might consider whether a 40-foot maximum length for docking structures at this property is unnecessarily prevents the reasonable use of the land or the boats involved, whether a 40-foot maximum dock length results in a significant benefit to the public health, safety, and welfare or property relative to the proposed 85.3-foot docking lengths with 21-foot side setbacks as proposed. You also may consider the past and proposed uses of the land in reviewing that criterion. I will just note for the BZA's benefit that there are some factors I put in my report for each of these 5 points that you should carefully consider, and you might just refer back to those as you have your comments tonight. So I won't belabor the point or spell out all those factors in detail. But the second criterion that needs to be addressed is the special exception would not unduly prevent the realization of the purposes of this ordinance, the Van Buren Township zoning ordinance. The special exception would not cause substantial harm or detriment to adjacent or nearby lands or boats, or the public interest or safety, nor be contrary to the intent of the Van Buren Township zoning ordinance, that there are unusual circumstances or conditions involved, and that the special exception is consistent with the goal of providing reasonable, equitable access to all budding lake owners. So I do have a model motion for the board to consider when making their decision. I strongly encourage you to at least refer to that motion and address all the 5 points individually if you're leaning toward a decision tonight. And there's a kind of a listing of what would, depending on what words are highlighted or accentuated, you can tell what would lead to a positive statement or a negative statement on that finding. So I really encourage you all to have some commentary on what you think based on some notes that have been provided, and use that that sheet as a guide. I don't want to spend too much of everybody's time going through my full report, but I will just let you know what my summary findings were. Above all else, I strongly encourage and recommend that the BZA use the motion template as I just addressed. If findings in the positive are found for the 5 criteria under section 3.120 F7C of the Van Buren Township zoning ordinance, I do find that the special exception request may be granted according to the zoning ordinance if those 5 criteria are met. If the request is granted, I would recommend some conditions and really redundant statements, because these are going to be required regardless. But I will just remind the BZA that the proposed dock structures in a marina are subject to site plan approval by the Township Planning Commission and special approval by the Township Board of Trustees. The proposed dock structures in the marina are subject to any necessary review and approval of the application by the state of Michigan, Eagle, and FERC. And that the use of the land must otherwise comply with Article 6, Chapter 42 of the Van Buren Township Code of Ordinances, which speaks to the use and enjoyment of the lake property. I'm happy to answer any questions about my report tonight. I encourage you to, again, look through those findings, and if you have any questions on what any of them mean, I have some kind of suggestions of how you might interpret those and factors you use to decide on. So with that, I will turn this back over to the BZA.
Okay, thank you. Next on the agenda is the presentation by the applicant. Mr. Jones, please stand up to the podium.
Thank you, Director Powers. Thanks to the board for consideration tonight. As was presented, we've provided updated drawings. We took into consideration a lot of the concerns around safety and things we heard throughout both with the BZA and Planning Commission. So we believe we've captured that much better and presenting it much better in the drawings presented tonight. We did reduce the length as a major change. That seems to be where most of the current concern has come from the proposed 120 down to 85.3. The reason it's 85.3, that's the current measurement. So we're 85 feet 4 inches currently into the water with the docks that are existing on the site. And those docks we installed in 2020 and have been operating since then safely and have had no major incidents or even minor incidents with those docks to date. So we modified that request around that. We do think we're a unique operation on the lake. I know the ordinance was written around mostly residential properties. We have a commercial operation. The only one I think that is similar in operation would be Sandy's Marine. So I've requested that you consider allowing us the 85.4 or 85.3 feet versus the current ordinance of 40 feet. Keep it short and sweet, and I think covered the majority of it. So if there's any questions for me, be happy to try and answer them.
Through the chair.
Yes.
So last time we met, it was a question that I had about going from the current 83, 84 feet, 83.3 feet, I think you said correct?
85.3.
85.3, up to the 120. And it was a direction from Eagle, I believe, that said you had to go that route. in order for the docks to be safe and permanent. So what has changed between that meeting and this one to where you can maintain pretty much the same distance into the water?
Yeah, so we've reduced the number of boats that will be able to park. The current proposal will only allow 16. And what changed with Eagle, the direction from Eagle was to eliminate the T-docks. Sorry. We had T-docks previously on our structure that we had built. We removed those through the process of our negotiations with Buren Township and the 34th District Court when we were going through that process. So we took off the T-docks. The concern from Eagle with the T-docks is that to get into those docks on the outside, we were encroaching on our neighbors' parcels to allow boats to come in and leave from those docks. So we removed the T's, and our goal was to maintain the same number of docks we would have with those T's, being 3 lengths out, is why we initially proposed 120 feet. So we now accepted that, you know, that we're not going to be able to get that. We reduced our request to 16 docks.
Okay. So is that still going to be adequate parking or docking of boats for you guys?
We would love to have more, but I just, you know, based on the size of the site and the circumstances that we feel we're faced with, you know, 16 is going to be the limit that we feel we can get through all 4, you know, BZA, Planning Commission, Eagle, and PERC. So,
And then your current docking space is 18, is that correct?
we currently, this configuration is exactly what we have today on this side. And then on the right side, we have a 2-layer T docks. So we go out 2 distances with T's. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8. And then 2, 4, 6, 7, 8. So we currently have 16. Yep, it's identical.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions for the applicant? Seeing none? Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Thank you.
I'm going to deviate a little bit from the agenda here. Normally, we don't have public comment on this issue during this portion of our meeting. However, I'm going to make an exception this evening. If there's anybody in the audience that would like to comment that has not been addressed before. Anything new on this item, I don't mind if you come to the podium and let this board know that.
Very good, thank you.
And through the chair, and sort of, if I may, just make one other comment about the content of the packet tonight. There was, just for everybody's awareness, there's also minutes from the past 2 meetings. I think I mentioned some names of people who have provided written correspondences that did not include. This board has also seen the comments from people who attended the previous 3 public meetings. So
Yes.
just want to make sure everybody's aware.
If you've submitted a letter, then obviously you've already made your statement.
Yeah, there's a point here that I think is important to be brought up. But we've talked about a lot of this stuff
I'm
before.
sorry, let me interrupt, time out. Please, state name, place your name and your address for the record, please. So the secretary can have that.
Jeffrey Riggs, 29 Potter Drive, Belleville, Michigan.
Thank you. Okay, now go ahead, I'm sorry.
Hello, BZA. We're back at this again. This is the different topic that I haven't heard much of, which I think is very important to consider. I like the reduction in the length. This is a very nice change by the BYC. Denton Road Bridge. That's a big issue because Denton Road Bridge, as all of you know, could be shut down to even boat traffic coming up. It's currently shut down for pedestrian traffic. Once they shut that down for boat traffic, which will be done, we know that because they're going to have to rip it down and rebuild it. 2 years of engineering, 1 or 2 of production on the new bridge. When they shut that down, the vast majority of the lake traffic is, well, right in front of the BYC. It's that particular portion of the lake east of the Denton Road Bridge. We have Sandy's Marina, which is typically packed. We have the DNR launch, the large one, not the little one down by Rosenville. So we've got the vast majority of the boats, more docks in that area. And when they shut that down, this is absolutely the wrong time to be considering extending docks out right now over double the distance of what is allowed for homeowners, and almost triple the distance of the average boat lift, which is 30 feet. Denton Road will be an issue and it will create a lot more traffic. So here's a suggestion, not here to complain about things, but to offer suggestions. It's a nice dock structure here. Perhaps these guys are good at designing, perhaps approve the 50-ish feet up to this point, and that's over what is currently allowed, and then tell them to design for an eventual improvement once we take a look at the traffic on the lake. Nobody knows this. We haven't looked at it. This is winter. So that's my main recommendation, which is a different topic from what has been discussed earlier. No one's taken into account the Denton Road Bridge. Let's look at it.
Okay, thank you for your comment.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Questions of the chair?
Question, yes.
Speak to the township.
Dan?
We're speculating that the bridge is going to be closed. I haven't heard anything about that. I mean, can you enlighten us on closure of the bridge or passing of boats?
I will have to get a better response on that from our staff, who have been more closely coordinating with the county on that question. Unfortunately, I do not know the answer to that question right now.
Would it be safe to assume though that until there is construction ongoing, which from my understanding, probably not until sometime next year, that the bridge actually would be passable through boats because there's no construction at that point? Is that safe to assume?
I don't know enough to say that that is safe to assume.
So the last comment was all speculation. We don't know if it's going to be closed or not.
As of right now, I don't know the plans or scope. And I can try to find out to report back to this board at the next available opportunity. Very easily.
Any other questions from the board to the comments? Sir, you have anything new to add?
Yes, sir.
Okay, please stand up to the microphone, please, and state your name and your address for the record.
Good evening. My name is Jack Ridenauer. I live on Harvey Lane, Van Buren Township. Chairman Herman, BZA board members, Director Akers. May I approach with a handout for you?
Yes, good. Please do.
I was looking for an article in the Richland local paper. The index took me back further than I expected to a similar issue that was brought by Mr. Jones and BYC back in 2011. And
Please state it in the microphone, please, with the audience at home cannot hear you.
I'm sorry. I was searching the Belleville Independent newspaper website for articles on this. This 2011 article came up in the search, where it appears that Mr. Jones and the BYC had requested a marina to be built on Mr. Jones's vacant lot on Liberty Street back in 2011. And at that time, the Van Buren Township determined that they did not have authority to grant an exception for a marina under the contract that Van Buren Township has with BERT on management of the lake. Now, I understand that this is more than 10 years ago, but to my knowledge, what's changed since then is now I have a lake ordinance, which we didn't have at that time. Okay. But I question under what authority Van Buren Township has to do this, when according to the Article 412B of the license to operate the lake and dam, Van Buren Township may grant permission without prior approval from FERC for four things. That's landscape plantings, non-commercial piers, landings, boat docks, and similar structures and facilities that can accommodate no more than 10 boats at a time, and where the facility is intended to serve a single family type dwelling. Number three, embankments, bulkheads, retaining walls, or similar structure. This project doesn't fall into one of those exemptions. Where in 2011, this township said they did not have authority to grant such a project. So I question at this point, what authority does the township have to grant this request?
Thank you.
Through the chair.
Yes,
Yeah, I'd like to ask, our township official that, when you reviewed the allowance for the exception, right? You're confident that the BZA has the authority to rule on this exception?
Yes, and I can explain why if the board.
just go ahead.
Okay. There are multiple steps to any approval on the township lake property. And this is a piece of information from time prior to the passage of the current township lake ordinance. So between 2014 and 2016, there were extensive discussions and development of an ordinance that provided a robust approval or authorization process for improvements to the township lake property. And the ordinance defines the township lake property, and it defines permitted uses that are administratively approved, approved by site plan review by the planning commission, and approved by special land use approval by special approval by the planning commission and township board. It is still likely true, and we're confirming this will likely require FERC approval, will absolutely require EGLE approval. But what this process is meant to do is to provide a more robust initial authorization and vetting process that the township can use to ensure that its local requirements and preferences that materialize in that ordinance are addressed before a plan is actually presented to these higher agencies with generally more authority or broader authority over issues, so that the plan that is submitted to those agencies represents a plan that has been pre-authorized by the township's boards and commissions. There cannot, it may be the case that there cannot be final approval or construction permits or a final authorization on construction prior to FERC or EGLE approval. That very much may be the case, and that's something that we will have to address as it comes up. But the general process is that these reviews get handled through the local ordinance that has been developed. All the dimensional criteria that have been extensively developed in the Lakeshore ordinance that was passed in 2016 first get reviewed at the township level, including the exceptions, which are authorized under section 3.120 F7. And then they will materialize as a plan that will be presented to EGLE, who will have a public input process, and then presumably FERC, which we again have to confirm. So long story short is that there is authority to go through this process and have these actions on the request at this time prior to EGLE and FERC approval.
So just to clarify, and you did read those sections out earlier that showed that we did have the authority to rule on the exception.
Yes.
That that this information is somewhat out of date, since it was all the way back into 2009 and 2011.
Yes, my understanding is that at that time there was not a ordinance that addressed these design items as comprehensively as we now have in front of us. So there was no real pre-authorization process like we have today that works the same way as it does today, and therefore just reviewing solely based on the merits of what's in the FERC license, it looks as though there's an opinion that the township could not approve, take a final action to approve before the FERC.
Okay, all right, and just one more point through the chair. I believe this also discusses Liberty Street, which is no longer where the BYC is. I believe that there's
That's
house.
all information doesn't pertain to this.
Okay,
Thanks. Okay, in order to clarify, you have a comment that has now been addressed before?
I should have.
Okay, please come up and state your name and your address, please.
My name's Kathleen Walsh. I reside at 45415 Harmony Lane, Van Buren Township.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I understand that the ordinance was written after 2011, but the point is the FERC contract has not been changed. And under the FERC contract, there's supposed to be approval. If the BZA gives approval to what the BYC is requesting, I'm concerned that it may be taken as if they now have carte blanche to move forward. And there have been times on this lake where things have been started, in fact, finished against ordinance, and absolutely nothing, except perhaps a letter, has been written. So I would hope if the BZA approves this, that it is approved with the caveat that nothing is to be started until all of the federal and state requirements have been met. Otherwise, I think the FERC, and certainly I've never seen a FERC officer over here checking anything going on, right? So we know that the FERC will not be here to make sure this is done right. And I would hope that the township would not get themselves in a position where we authorize a violation of a contract that we have with the federal government. Thank you.
Now, that's why we have the authority to have the hearings first prior to it being sent for their approval. It has to be approved here so that they can look at their site plan for their approval. Nothing will happen until it's approved on both sides. Just like,
Three sides.
well, correct. But you get my idea.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Same for you. Name and address, please.
Corey Gibson, 43160 East Huron River Drive. I'll try and keep this brief. I'm happy to hear that we're not looking at a plan for 120 feet anymore. However, I feel like this was the long game all the way with a waste of taxpayers' time and money. On this print, you can see this structure that was never permitted to begin with and followed up with permits later. This docks, the submitter maintains that the docks have always been at 83.5 feet or 85.3 feet, whatever the number was. With the tools that the township uses to evaluate, assess properties and look at violations, which is Google Maps, if you go back to 2012, before either of those structures were there, these docks were at 50-ish feet, plus or minus. They went to 8 feet without, or 80 feet without permits. And I think we proposed this 120 feet to now just settle back for right where we're at. I just want to point out, I mean, how we got here isn't very on the record or up and up.
May I clarify some issues here?
Sure.
First of all, they have non-conforming dock there today. They can rebuild that, improve it a little, and be in the same place that they are today. You'll see the same thing. The new type of proposal is for improved structure, including safety features, et cetera, and the site plan is not approved by us.
Correct.
The site plan will be approved by the BZA, so we're just allowing it to go forward if we do so. That's not a given, but that's supposedly if that happens. So to restate it, they can use the same dock that today, make them permanent docks, remove the pole that's in place already, that's a hazard, stick it out at 120 feet, and you'll have the same thing there. This would, if approved, would clear the site, get rid of an eyesore, and have a better proposal.
I understand. If I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that they're at 120 feet now, or they're at 80 feet now?
They're at 85.3 feet today.
Correct.
So they can just rebuild it, improve it a little, so that it be still non-conforming, but they've improved the sign.
We got-
Still be there.
We got to that distance without
Yes.
permits.
They're non-conforming.
Not
That's history.
Okay.
That's prior to our discussion here, that's beyond this code. Anybody else on the board? No?
Yeah, do them first.
Yes, ma'am.
Laura, right now, we're 12993 Linda Vista, Van Buren Township. I'd like to comment real quickly on what you just said about non-conforming. The difference between non-conforming that was permitted and approved legally and non-conforming and just built without permits, which the township does have the authority to have people take down. Buildings and property must be permitted as required by the ordinances. And there is nothing wrong with the township telling somebody who put something up illegally to take it down just because it's non-conforming is not a blanket grandfathered statement. There's nothing about grandfathering in the codes. So I'd like to clarify that because I'll go home tonight and build a garage on my property. And when you come back next year and tell me it's a problem, I'll say, well, it's non-conforming, I just didn't get permits. That's not, the township has the authority and I think the responsibility to make people take down and remove property that is built without permits illegally. And there's a difference between that and legally non-conforming.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you just said that they can rebuild it the exact same safer just because it's non-conforming. That's not technically code compliant then, and that is not allowed.
That's still up for debate though.
As a code official for 15 years, I will say that non-conforming does not mean that it is allowed to stay. I've been a code enforcement for a very long time. Okay, so I want to take down to the Remerica office that I drove by my way here on Belleville Road, Canton Center Road there, next to Harris Park. Right, the private property, it's a business use, commercial, just like they say that the BYC is. And there's a park right next to it, Harris Park. And if the Remerica people decide that they want to make Harris Park into a private property where members, people that they've sold homes to or businesses to, are allowed to hang out at that park and use it, would the township agree to that? Would they take away township property, which is what the lake is, and give it to a private group for personal use? That's my question, because that's what you're doing when you take an extra 40 feet of lakefront and lake use and give it to a private entity. And I don't think that's fair. And I think if you go through the outline of the 5 topics that were supposed to be addressed for this, I don't think it's unnecessarily a detriment to the BYC to not have the extra boat slips. They operate all winter long just fine with no boat slips. So the extra boat slips to me does not qualify for something that they need to reasonably enjoy their property. Is it a harm or detriment to adjoining adjacent lands? It is. It's 40-foot less lake access that people have. That impacts the community and it impacts everyone who visits here, who comes here to enjoy our lake or anything else. And if the township is going to do this, what about Johnny's? What about Sandy's? What about Hayworth's? What about all the other businesses that want that? I was on the board that wrote the township ordinance in 2016, and we spent multiple months, years, hours working on this. And the 5th one is the intent of the language that was developed. The intent of the language was 40 feet. Let me be very clear on that. There was no intent to allow for additions on that. And if you're going to allow for this addition, then people are going to go out and build docks all over the place and put them as long as they want without permits. And then you have to say that that's okay for them too, because that's for their personal enjoyment, just like the BYC wants to do with their docks.
Thank you for your comment. Well, that's one more and then we find on this. I just don't give this out for additional comments that were made before.
My name is Tim Krager. I live at 41166 Lakeview Court, Van Buren Township. A little speech here. Bear with me. Good evening, Township Board and the people of our community. This subject has created such a division in our community that it has weighed heavily on my heart, so much so that I've lost sleep over this. And I just want to say a few words on the topic of community, passion, and goodwill. Everyone in this room is here because they are passionate about our community.
from BYC members to the non-BYC members and the people on the board. We are here because we care deeply about our community, so I'd like to start out first by talking to the BYC members about the passionate people in our community that are against this project. These folks are just passionate people that do not have anything against the BYC, and they think it has been a great asset to the community. They just are against this project. Now I'd like to talk about the BYC. First of all, I'd like the record to state that I am not a BYC member. It is also very obvious the BYC members have passion and love for our community. The list is long of the goodwill that they bring to our community, which is such a positive asset, such as sponsoring the school robotics team, providing championship rings to the Belleville High School football team, multiple lake cleanups each year, providing an army of volunteers to help with Lake Fest activities, participating in a Winterfest parade, providing Christmas to dozens of underprivileged families in the community each year, and the awesome fireworks display that is totally funded by the BYC. There are many more items as well, not mentioned, but I bring this just to remind everyone of the goodwill gestures that helps create positive energy in our community. The BYC has a beautiful building which they graciously allow the public to use for many functions and fundraisers, including the annual polar bear plunge that raises funds for Special Olympics, the Warthogs Hog Roast to benefit families of fallen first responders, and countless other fundraisers events each year. These are the ones that are visible. The members work behind the scenes donating to local charities almost weekly. And then there's Mr. Jones, the visionary and founding member of this club. It's also obvious Mr. Jones has great passion for this community. He has chosen to invest in this community, which has brought a lot of new businesses and great energy to our community. Granted, some of it is for profit, but because of his love and passion for this community, he could have invested elsewhere, but he chose to invest in our community. To wrap things up, because of the goodwill and positive asset Mr. Jones and the BYC has brought to our community, it is my hope and desire that we can reach some kind of compromise to allow the BYC to expand their docks. Thank you. Sir, I have a question. Would you like to submit that letter for the record? Sure. Staff or the secretary? Sure. Either one. Thank you. Then we'll go into our records with the rest of the letters and comments we have received. At this time, I'm going to close this portion of the hearing, and I'm going to turn it over to the Board of Appeals. I'll start with Mr. Sellers, and we'll work the way around, and then I'll do myself at last. Any comments you'd like to make? How you feel about this? Explain the reason why, how you want to vote, whether you want to approve it, deny it, or give your reasons why you're voting.
Well, let me start off first off stating that I am an avid voter and, vote right by the BYC, and originally had some concerns about the 120 feet. Knowing where they're at now and knowing the curvature of the lake, and the land, the shore it will. I do not believe the current link or the proposed links would be a hindrance to voter traffic. Now it was brought up, I can see if there's a influx of traffic on either side of the lake, that could potentially be an issue that's short-lived. But without knowing if that's even going to happen, that's all speculation. So we can't really take that into consideration for our vote. With that being said, I mean, obviously, the things that the BYC does for the community are all great. We appreciate that. However, this is a separate issue. I think this has to be looked at separately. And is it fair and consistent with conforming and non-conforming? And because this is a different piece of land and this land is used for something that's different, used comparably to Sandy's or potentially even Johnny's at that point. I think that we do have to make a vote and decide if this is something that we want to make an exception for. And once again, that's why we're here, right? We're a board and we have to make rulings on exceptions and not the majority. So with that being said, in the proposed plan, I would vote yes at this time.
Thank you. Mr. John?
Mr. Chair, I want to point out, I'm so sorry, I got everybody's name who was at the podium except for the person who was, I believe, on the Lake Commission and wanted more clarification on the understanding of legal non-conforming and, well, unpermitted. Would like to point out for the other commissioners that the plan that was submitted and drafted, one of the things the planning commission requested was a drawing of the current conditions of the site. And what appears on the plan and might be confusing at first glance is that what we have is not a drawing of the current conditions. We have a drawing of the conditions in 2022. Those, I'm sorry, 2020, showing the finger docks is what the applicant refers to them as. Those docks, it's my understanding that those are legal non-conforming structures. They're legal because they were in place at the time the lake ordinance went in. They're non-conforming because you couldn't rebuild them today. They don't meet the zoning ordinance requirements. Those docks are legal non-conforming structures in 2020. However, the condition today, one of those structures has been removed and has been replaced with an 85-foot long dock. My understanding is that that dock has not been permitted. That is an unpermitted structure. It's not legal non-conforming. It can't stick around in perpetuity because it doesn't have that grandfather. And there is specifically a grandfather clause in the lake ordinance for structures that went in early. So I can understand the confusion because the plan doesn't show current conditions. It shows the previous legal non-conforming conditions, and it shows the requested future conditions, but it doesn't show the current conditions. So I hope that clarifies, and if that clarifies it for the audience, we do understand what the conditions are and that they're not accurately represented on the plan. I will also comment on the FERC license. I have a copy of the FERC license. I've looked at the FERC license. I believe that I'm not a lawyer. We have township attorneys for that, but I strongly suspect that from the wording of our license that this dock, any commercial construction or dock on the lake, regardless of whether it needs a special exception, is going to have to meet FERC approval. For the people that don't know, the FERC is an acronym. It's Federal Energy Resource Commission. They get involved at the federal level because we're a hydroelectric generation facility. The dam makes, what is it, 2 megawatts power? Anyway, it makes it a federal project. So they have a hand in regulating what goes into the lake, because what goes into the lake could potentially go through the hydropower plant. I mean, that would be bad. If we put in something that wasn't compatible. I believe the FERC license also specifically says that as part of our license that there's a limit to 75 feet that we're allowed to have a right of way of any structure going out as far as 75 feet. So I have a concern that if a dock put in at a length of 85 feet were to make it past us locally, it may not make it past the Federal Energy Resource Commission because of the clause in the license that says 75 feet. And I understand that as part of the process, the terms of the FERC license may not have been reviewed entirely by staff. It may not have gone through legal yet. Hey, it may not be an issue. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I did read the license and it does seem like there's a 75-foot limit, and it could be a concern for the applicant. However, I believe we do have the ability to make an exception as we see fit. Whether or not that passes state regulation or federal regulation, that's up to those bodies to determine. So I think we do have the authority to pass local a local recommendation on the subject. With regard to the only 5 criteria that matter to us today, for this exception, there are 5 of them. And I think it's important that we consider them individually. Since we're gonna go round robin, we're not gonna have back and forth, I guess. I'll tell you what my feeling is on the 5 points, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. What we're looking at today is granting a special exception, and that is covered by section 3.120C. The standards for special exceptions are that the BZA shall not grant a special exception to any provision of this section 3.120 unless it first makes all of the following findings. There are 5 of them. These are the 5 findings that staff put up on the board and included in their letter. The first of which is that the enforcement of the provisions requested for special exception would unnecessarily prevent the reasonable use of land or boats involved without resulting benefit to public health, safety, welfare of persons in the property. I've been in a lot of the meetings for this project because I'm on the planning commission as well. I'm the acting chairman of the planning commission, so I've got a lot of discussion. It looks to me that the club has been operating for years as a yacht club, as a double yacht club. Before that, I believe it was even another social club, Moose Lodge, who had docks too. It appears to me that it could continue operating as a boat club with its current legal non-conforming docks or dock under the continuation of existing uses clause in 3.120F6C. That is specifically the grandfather clause. The existing dock that's there, that's approximately 50 feet. No one is saying that has to come out. You will get to keep it. The enforcement of the 40-foot length provision does not seem to prevent reasonable use of the land. The rental facility, the clubhouse, the tiki bar, the pool still get to be used by the same number of club members or rental customers, regardless of the exception being granted. In my opinion, I don't believe condition 1 has been met. Condition 2, the special exception would not unduly prevent the realization of the purposes of the ordinance. Well, in order to figure that out, you really have to know what the purpose of the ordinance is. And I think we've heard from some members of the Lake Committee, but it's also stated in the ordinance what the purpose is. And it's included in the letter from staff. It's in section 3.120A. It's the intent and purpose of the township board to adopt reasonable regulations for the number and placement of docks. The takeaway is that 40 foot is a reasonable regulation for the placement and number of docks. In paraphrasing the rest of that statement, really the ordinance is to place limits on commercial development, reasonable limits, and to protect safety of lake users and the rights of the lakefront owners by placing how far you can put a dock out into the lake. That really is the purpose of, or very large purpose of the lakefront ordinance. And in this case, our lakefront committee and our board of trustees, our elected officials who act on behalf of everyone in our community, found that 40 foot was a reasonable length. Granting an exception to that to make it out farther seems to be going against the purpose of that ordinance or that clause. And I would say that unfortunately, it's not. I don't believe we've met the criteria there. It's long. There's 5 criteria. One of the third criteria is the special exception wouldn't cause substantial harm or detriment to adjacent or nearby lands or boats or the public interest or safety, nor be contrary to the intent or purposes of the ordinance. Well, again, I think the intent and the purpose of the ordinance is to limit the dock length. So I believe that clause is not found. But with regard to harm and detriment to public safety, we can say that 40 foot is reasonably safe because, well, the ordinance and the Lake Committee and our board of trustees, through their consideration, felt that 40 foot was reasonably safe. If it wasn't safe, they wouldn't have made it 40 foot. They don't have anything to say about whether 60 foot is safe or 80 foot is safe or even longer is safe. It's very difficult for us to comment on the safety of the structure longer than 40 feet because, as members of the public have pointed out, their there really ought to be a traffic study. We ought to see how much traffic goes by. We ought to see how close people run to the docks, close to the docks. Some of our planning commissioners brought that up several times, that we really don't have enough information to say whether or not a dock larger than 40 feet is safe. And that's a lack of information. If we had that information to fall back on, it sure would help us make that determination. But unfortunately, we don't have a traffic study. Maybe we should get one. We don't have one today. So I would say that a dock that goes out twice as far as the maximum allowable length, and that goes out significantly farther than the docks along the adjacent shoreline. I think the longest one is maybe 30 feet, but most of them are less than that. Seems like it sticking out on the end of a point that could, I'm not saying does present a safety hazard, but I could see how it could. And the criteria is that we're not allowed to make a detriment to public safety. I would say that criteria is perhaps not met. Criteria number 4 is that unusual circumstances or conditions are involved. This is a zoning question. This is a zoning and planning question, which means the unusual circumstances, like the staff wrote, the unusual circumstances have to do necessarily with the shape of the property. The type of the property. If this was a keyhole property, where it was a very small lake frontage, maybe a small line that goes out to the lake, very small amount of lake frontage with a larger property behind it, that would be a unique circumstance because the amount of lake frontage would be abnormally small. If it was a pie-shaped property, where the property lines met in the middle of the lake, but only a few feet out into the middle of the lake, such that you couldn't put a dock out there without violating your neighbor's projected property line, that would be a unique circumstance with the property. But that's not what we have here. We have a rectilinear property. It's square. The property lines are parallel with each other. It's got a reasonable amount of lakefront footage. It does not appear that there are unusual conditions involved with the property. And again, this part 4 is a property question. It's a parcel question. It's not, doesn't have to do with, the club or what they do, or if they run a restaurant, or that's not what the question's asking. It's asking about the shape of the property. It's a rectangle. I don't feel that the condition is met to grant the exception. Finally, the special exception has to be consistent with the goal of providing reasonable, equitable access to all abutting lake owners. This one is a little tougher because I find that the UIC is really, it's a business. It's a nonprofit, I know that, but it's a business. It's got a restaurant and a bar. It has rental facilities. It's a business. Having additional dock parking at the business on the lake, it grants a competitive advantage to the business that we grant that exception to. And for the exception to be equitable, we would have to grant that same exception to any of the businesses abutting lakefront owners with a business that wanted the same. And we haven't done that yet. Additionally, I think there's merit in some of the public feedback that by allowing the exception, you're necessarily removing parts of the lake from the rest of the lakefront owners that they previously had access to, giving it to a single owner when you're not granting it to every owner. And therefore, I don't believe that it is necessarily an equitable access to all abutting lake owners. I do think that their existing non-conforming structure out there at 50 feet, I see merit in having a dock that goes out farther than 40 feet in this site. I see merit in coming to a compromise that allows the existing legal non-conforming dock to become more conforming by perhaps narrowing it from the property lines and allowing the dock to be rebuilt at more conformant in one direction, but it can't be less conformant in another. Which this 85-foot proposal it's narrower in one direction, but it's longer than the other, so it's not really a like for like situation. But that actually doesn't come up because it's not really one of the five criteria. that's my feeling on the 5 things that we've been asked to weigh our decision on. They are clear in the ordinance. It's, again, nothing against the applicant or the club. I'm not a club member. I am a voter, avid. And I definitely appreciate having docking space and the need for it. But I think that the ordinance in this case gives us clear direction, and that those 5 cases, I find that we haven't met all of them. I think that's the end of my long-winded comment, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for the length.
No, don't apologize. Mr. Buren, you're next.
Well, I tell you, I don't know whether he's a lawyer, I'm pretty sure it sounds like
I'll tell you what on TV. I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express.
that. Well, what I've been listening to and Pan asked us earlier, tried to not be as repetitive as we could hold off on the repetition, so I'm gonna try to do that. Mr. John, everything you said is what I was thinking, you put it in great words. The few things I'd like to add to that is, there's something that Dan didn't bring up earlier, question to Buren Township architecture and engineers, have they given us their stamp of approval in addition to what we have to do, because we understand from what we have to learn in order to do the job that we have to do and do it correctly. I can't remember the lady's name, but she said she'd been around for 15 years or whatever. You're right. But the bottom line is that we're taught to try and treat every person, business, or applicant pretty much the same, except for rare occasion and exceptions. And I think the exceptions, if any were to be put in place, Mr. Jura would have mentioned that. And from what he said, is from my heart is what I'm thinking. The other thing is, we also have the push on there that deals with the fire department. I don't know if that has been included. Have they given their stamp of approval? Yes, in water, but we hear the fires. So has that been approved? And my thing is that until FERC, the architectural field, the engineers, and the fire department give us their stamp of approval, I can't see myself going anywhere.
I'll try and answer a couple of your questions. It's not our purpose to approve a site plan. We have it in front of us for informational purpose only. The site plan is not complete. It doesn't have the seal, it needs an architect seal or an engineering seal. It doesn't have the movies that would be required. But those are all issues addressed with the planning commission. That's not our job. Our job is to either approve the project as is proposed with the exceptions that they're requiring, to vote it up or down. And to reinstate, our decision is final. If we vote on it one way or the other today, that's the way it is, or going to be. It either moves ahead to the planning commission or back to the planning commission, however you want to call it. The process will continue from there on. It's going to get to the planning commission, go to staff, go through the public safety department will have an opportunity during the planning process, and then the planning will approve it, deny it. Those are all procedural steps that have to be taken. And then the final, once it's approved at the township board of trustees, it'll go to FERC and the rest of the state agencies for their final approval. And then an issue will be, if it's approved at all those levels, it'll be approved for building permit.
Okay.
Those are the procedures and the steps that will have to be followed, even if it's approved today. That is a big if, I don't know who will.
Let me go back.
Yes, please.
Dan, would you put those back on, please?
I sure can. Plan, would you like the plan, Mr. Crisette?
5 steps.
5 steps, sure.
And as was stated earlier, to me, number one, I don't see. Number two is non-conforming. Number three is non-conforming. Number 4 and 5. To me, I can't go with it.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Mr. Hans, you're next.
Well, I'm just trying to sit here and formulate somewhat of a retort. Unfortunately, these 5 items were the same 5 items that we had back in January, prior to 2 planning commission meetings that that this was supposed to go in front of the planning commission, and then bring it all the way back, and they're still the same 5 ones that we had back in January. So I just like to make that point very clear. As far as it precedenting or non-precedent setting, we've had this discussion back on the last BZA meeting, that this is an exception, which is different than a variance, puts it in a completely different ballpark. Variances can be precedent setting, and we asked about this. Exceptions can't. And I think BZA said it very well, that unless there is another club that was on the same type of zoned property, that would really be the only circumstance that you could actually use this as precedent setting. So in this case, and I was very concerned about this when this case first came up back in January. And I think that issue has been discussed, and I'll reiterate the fact that it's not precedent setting. I believe the BZA did go back and spend a lot of time with the planning commission updating these plans to make sure that they took safety into account and added lights, which I think is really important. I do believe that they do meet all 5 of these criteria. I think that given that it's a club, given the size of the club and their current dock situation, I think would make meet number 1 without a doubt. I think it's a benefit for the community. It's different than somebody's house. It's different than a restaurant or Sandy's. I think it makes it somewhat unique, and therefore I'm in favor of supporting this exception. That's all I have.
Thank you. Trustee, you're next.
To the chair.
Yes.
I'm not gonna keep kicking the can down the road. Commissioner Jar was pretty much on point with his comments. I agree with his assessment of the 5 criteria. I do have concerns about the length of the dock. I do have safety concerns, which may be or may not be, maybe unfounded or not, but I think that the ordinance is clear on the 40-foot length. You say that an exception is not precedent setting, but that's not necessarily so, because another applicant can ask for the same exception, and if they're denied, you could be subject to a lawsuit. So to say that offhand, it is not necessarily so, it has a probably decided in the court of law. So I don't feel that the 5 criteria is met.
Okay. Thank you. That leaves it to me. I'm just gonna, restate a few of the facts to begin with. First of all, this property is located in a residential district. In my 30+ years here in the township, I never had a residential residence on this property. So it's not really a residential area. And the second point is, it's not really a marina either. It's a club. But in order to build docks, it has to be termed a marina. So we have an issue with interpretation here. Now, my next thing is that our decision, whatever we do here, is final. I've stated that before. However, the applicant has come up with a compromise plan, about a third less than what they originally proposed. Another comment that was made, the bridge closure, that is keeps traffic on either side of the bridge. And we cannot make a decision based on something that's going to happen in the future. That's not really something that we can consider as pro or con. I've also stated that the pipeline and the rest of the procedure will be followed through the planning commission and the steps going forward. So that's not our job here. Our job is to either approve or deny, and that decision is going to be final. I want the applicant to be aware of that. And let me see if I missed anything. Yeah, that would include the traffic study that is requested, but through the applicant's planning commission process. So I was inclined, and I'm still inclined, to give a temporary, to give an approval on the permit based on the, and I'll make recommendations if we need to go to that way. The stipulations on how we can proceed after that part of the motion. But before I ask for a roll call vote here, I want the applicant to please return to the voting. Mr. Jones, please return so it'll be on record and people at home can hear you.
Sure.
I'm going to give you the option to ask for a postponement at this moment, based on what you heard tonight. Otherwise, I'll call for a vote. A motion to vote.
I would ask you to vote.
To vote?
Please.
Okay, all right. All right, staff.
Mr. Chair, yes, I just wanted to, it behooves me to mention, there were some questions that were raised earlier in the meeting, and I think that a couple of our commissioners already want to clarify a couple of these things, but I had notes to follow up on them. I do apologize for the lack of my knowledge on the Dent Bridge issue, but I did get a comment back from our municipal services director that we have been informed by the county that it is safe to boat under the bridge so long as normal precautions are taken. When the bridge will be under construction, we will have to determine that when we have a method of construction that's identified. We assume there will be some periodic closures, but we intend to keep it open if we are able. So that's the stance we have right now. And the other kind of loose end that was a little bit murky because I don't think I covered some of the history prior to tonight's meeting like I had in one of the past meetings, but there was a unpermitted construction that began. And so the docking structure that currently today is on the west end of the site is closer to this 83 to 85 foot range. But I do want to point out that the applicant had provided a plan that showed the previous lawful non-conforming condition. As Commissioner Jar said, it's a dock that extends, and I'm not sure if there is a length dimension. I think it is somewhere up just over 50 feet, but it does show the side setbacks in the lake lot lines of 0 to 6 feet on those sides. So what you have is a dock layout that now brings everything away from those side setbacks and the side lot lines and out to the distance that you're considering tonight. So I just wanted to reiterate that was a little unclear and just part of the history. We had gone through the whole question of unpermitted docks and did go through the courts and resulted with a process of being requested to provide for a viable route for review of the unpermitted structure, which we would do typically for other cases as well, to give a viable path for review before you have something be torn out completely. And so that's what kind of resulted in the process we see. So there was clear information provided by the applicant on the pre-existing conditions in the plans.
Thank you.
My only other comment is just to pitch again, to please use the motion template to refer back to those five criteria, what the motion is.
And through the chair, just, I think it is very important, as we've heard and listened to, obviously the community that are here tonight, as well as everyone that's up here, the concerns, right? I mean, at this point, based on what we heard, we are split. So when you take in consideration that no matter what we say, yes, as it may be final, however, this has several other steps to go through for it to be finalized. So, I would say take that in consideration as you make your vote and know that we're just helping get to the next step for approval or change of there, because considering it may go from 85 feet to 75 feet, right? So we're just getting into that next level. We are not the end all be all when it comes to this particular project.
Yes, and that would be that's why I would be basically in favor of going that way. Because what we do, if approved, is not really final. The outcome is what all the whole process will do.
I mean, and to this point, there's already been a change. There's already, they've already looked at it and said 120 feet isn't going to work. That's why we're here with 85 feet. Right. So there's already been some sort of saying, hey, propose this, and then it potentially could get approved. Right. With that being said, it's already been looked at, right? So
it could potentially be only 75 feet, or even less.
Right, or be approved.
But
I just want you guys to think about that.
yeah, we're just have to either move it forward or stop. That's basically how everyone's done. So with that said,
Through the chair. Yeah, so if we end up in a tie on this, what happens?
it fails.
Fail?
Yeah,
What tie fails?
finally fails. So that's why I called the applicant to give them an opportunity to postpone.
Through the chair,
Yes.
I think the proper procedure is going to be to typically have a motion in the affirmative for a decision one way or the other. So if there's a consensus of a majority here tonight, then typically what you do is have somebody read a motion in the affirmative for that decision. And then based on that vote, it would pass or fail. You don't tend to want to have a motion fail on a voter or be denied based on a tie or a motion made in the affirmative one way that gets denied. You prefer to have some guidance on what the consensus is and then make a vote. So I think technically the tie vote would mean that I'm not actually sure. So it would mean that the motion fails, but I'm not actually certain that would mean that the request fails. So you may need to consider whether there will be a tie vote if that's something that you should take up at a different time.
Do we know for sure what actually occurs then if we end up with a tie vote? Is this something that we should wait until we have an odd number of commissioners here, or that we have the full number of commissioners for that matter?
What we know is true is that if there is for the request to be granted, there needs to be a majority of the present members of the regular members of the board. So If it does not pass, and I'm looking right now, I'm just checking.
Ideally, we would have several members
Yes,
resolving that issue, but we know we have six.
There may have been changes one way to the other, because we've had.
My past experience has been a typo fails a motion. But I can stand to be corrected.
It's not the majority of the total number of commissioners, not, it's a.
No, it's members present.
It is
It's
members,
members present.
says it in the
And I
bylaws.
approve that. Yeah.
yes.
Note to self for next planning commission meeting. Figure that rule out.
We can take a 5-minute break while you research.
I'd be glad to do that, and I apologize for
Yeah.
that's an area not being clarified. I
Okay,
think there's-
let's take a 5-minute recess and then staff figure this out so we're sure of the legal. Thank you. 5-minute recess.
That's okay. I'm so sorry. Your case is still coming up and it's not really your request, it's an interpretation. So that's still yet to be determined on tonight's agenda. There was a hearing and there was no comments during the thing. So we'll have to get to that after this. Just really exception. It's different from yeah, I mean, it's the typical.
But yeah,
You get by with heads.
I have asked it, so people that.
yeah, you have to.
A lot of energy.
Oh. Yeah. That's this one, this one up here. Here. It's writing long, it's paragraph, move stories.
Harmony. But I was just gonna say, I had to buy.
Oh.
It's
Excellent.
she's very nice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was wondering. So that we.
Live on the thing we have.
And I'll bring lunch.
Next one. It's no. Jesus, good. Oh, wait.
That's a big issue. I guess
I go with whatever. It's not French. It's what I know. I love that. Over years. It's still been removed. When we move it inside.
I call the meeting back to order. Please be seated. I think we have a clarification for staff on what our vote would mean.
Yes, I have enough information, I think, that could guide you in this decision. I'd like to put on the screen just for clarity.
Okay.
And there are two things kind of being contemplated at the same time. One is whether a request can be granted with less than a majority of regular members of the BZA. And the other is just whether a decision can be enacted based on a certain amount of membership. I'm not sure why this isn't showing on the screen. Let me put this. Try this one more time, but while I try to project this, the section 7 of the Board of Zoning Appeals Rules of Procedure state that any decision made by the BZA shall require a majority vote of the membership of the BZA. Voting shall ordinarily be by voice vote, provided, however, that a roll call vote shall be required if requested by any BZA member or directed by the chairperson. All BZA members shall vote on every motion placed on the floor unless there is an impermissible conflict of interest as established in Article 6 or is otherwise prohibited. I think that is enough to indicate that we need a majority vote of the membership of the BZA to make any decision. That is the opinion that I have based on my understanding of our rules of procedure. And there are specific reflections in those rules of what's in the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act for BZAs particularly. So I do not think that there can be a decision rendered based on a split vote for the BZA.
In order to comply with that, we need a motion to postpone till we get a full board.
If the interpretation is that there will be a split vote, that is the proper course of action, yes. So it may be worth.
Can we do a preliminary, through the chair, can we do a preliminary vote before going to that step then? Based on everything we just said, did anybody change their mind, essentially? I would still.
I have no objection to see where everybody stands, but if you want to make a motion.
I mean, based on the fact that we're not the end all be all here, we're getting into the next step and it's already been looked at and given and changed and edited. And the situation that's an exception, I would still continue to vote yes.
I have an additional question. If I may,
Yes,
through the chair.
sure.
So this has to deal with the, if the BYC wanted to upgrade their current docks, because their current docks are floating docks. And if they wanted to upgrade those docks to, ones that were, attached to the floor of the lake, but they remain the same size, would they need an exception in order to do that? Because it sounds like they were grandfathered in before. And if they were grandfathered in, it was grandfathered in based on length, right? And not the type of dock.
Mr. Chair? Okay.
Yes.
It was grandfathered in by the fact that it was in existence at the time the lake ordinance went in. It wasn't grandfathered in based on any of its dimensionality.
Okay.
It's just that those floating docks existed in 2017. They did, right? They did. So that's why it's grandfathered. That's why the one remaining floating dock is grandfathered. Staff, do you agree with that assessment?
I would agree with that assessment. I would add that under the Belleville Lake Shoreline District's ordinance, any structures that are considered grandfathered, maintenance and repair of those structures shall not be deemed a change, alteration, or expansion of prior usage. So there is some discretion in the terminology of what would be considered maintenance and repair, but generally you can maintain and repair structures in their current configuration.
Current dimension.
I would literally interpret it that way. Yes, I would say that in their current location and layout in terms of footings in the ground for, say, a deck or something like that.
Trustee Martin, I see you trying to make a comment, or are you?
Yeah, through the chair.
Yes.
So we spoke earlier about something that happened in 2020 with the length of docks. I think Commissioner Garrett mentioned in year 2020. Is that when,
Believe that was-
when the longer docks was put in?
No, that's the year. That's the year on the plan for the app.
So the floating docks existed until 2020, and then in 2020, we put in the permanent west dock. That is the 85, which is longer. I believe the floating structure is about 56 feet. The permanent structure is 85.3.
Does that answer the question, sir?
Yes.
Yeah, I pointed out the 2020 because that was what was on the plans that were submitted to the planning commission the last time.
Yeah, that's information in front of us.
I have another question to the chair.
Yes.
And this is Mr. Power. So should this request be denied today, they can't bring this back at 85 feet, but they can come back again at another length or a different exception or what?
I will try to cite the exact language. Generally, decisions of the BZA are final and would need to be appealed to the circuit court. There are terms in which a rehearing can be considered. I apologize. I want to make sure I'm just citing right from the ordinance,
I
but
don't have that in front of me.
No,
in the
I think you misunderstand. I'm asking, could they come back again with a different proposal, a brand new proposal? That was say 75 feet or 80 or 60?
it has
Is that possible?
It has been my interpretation that the request is for the exception from 40 feet. And so if there's a denial of the request for the exception from 40 feet, that is,
To cover anything?
that would be a final decision of the BZA. I will say that the BZA is on that point without general authority to reconsider a matter it has decided and from reversing its previous decision unless the facts and circumstances which actuated the decision have so changed as to invalidate or materially affect the reason which produced and supported it, and no vested rights have intervened. So it's a long statement, but there would have to be materially different facts and circumstances around the request.
Through the chair.
Yes,
Is there any chance that we can make a proposal that could lessen what the applicant is asking for and be agreed upon by the group here?
More likely, you could contemplate a request by the applicant. I think the issue is it's not necessarily a trading situation where you could make requests that then they have to adhere to. So you have to look at a new submittal by the applicant and not necessarily dictate what the length is or tell them. You could approve based on conditions, like the condition that this is 85.3 feet based on what the plan was turned in, but I would advise against imposing a different length without having the applicant kind of propose it.
I believe it's not our job to make the proposal.
Mr. Chair, yeah.
Mr. Jones, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think here in the discussion, I would, request we delay until you have a full board and postpone to the decision till at least an odd number anyway.
We can comply with that. Thank you. Anybody want to make a motion to postpone until we have a full board to vote on this issue?
Until we have a full.
Is there support?
Could I refine that, motion? So, what I'd like to propose is a postponement on case 22-056.
That is correct.
That is accepted by the maker of the motion. Is there support?
I would still like to see where we all stand after all the communication and sidebar conversations we had. Personally.
Are you calling for a strong vote?
I am.
Okay.
I am.
I'm not willing to do that.
That means we have to rescind the motion that's on the floor to do that before we have a motion on the floor right now, so. Do we want to vote on the motion? This is discussion. Do we want to rescind that and postpone the vote on the motion to postpone, or do we want to do a straw vote instead first, or we can do it later?
Through the chair.
Yes.
Point of order, I think we have a motion on the floor, and although it's been properly seconded, I think that's my next.
No, we're in the discussion part of that.
Oh, we have to, discuss until it's been.
Okay,
Either it dies on the vine where nobody seconds it, or you have to second the motion.
didn't you second the motion?
No, I made the motion.
Oh.
Actually,
Oh, we can better correct the motion, okay. Do we have support for that motion? If not, it dies for lack of support. Now you can make your new motion. All in favor of? No, it dies for lack of support, I'm sorry, done.
I was gonna support the continuation or the postponement, and then we can do the straw.
Okay, now we have a second, any discussion? I'm sorry, I missed a second. See none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed likewise, motion carried. All right. Now motion is in order to do a straw vote if you'd like.
Yeah, I just wanted to see where we said, so we didn't have to delay this to the next.
Yeah, so yeah,
meeting.
no,
Correct. I mean, because I think there was a lot said after we went through the initial vote that, put it in perspective that we are not the last call and that our things have already been approved at this point or recommended to this point. With that being said, I'm still a yes.
a non-binding motion.
I'm sorry, through the chair. What is the purpose of this straw vote now?
So that the applicant know that we're tied. Officially. If we're tied.
I didn't want to second the other motion.
Are we out of order here, sir?
I don't know. That's through the chair. But that's it.
I agree. I don't see the need for that. He's asking if we can have a postpone, then you agree to that. There's second and moved, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, do we have a second on the original motion to have a straw vote?
Doesn't matter at this point.
Doesn't matter? Okay, all right, it dies. All right. So that action item has been postponed until we have a full board at our next scheduled meeting. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Our next item on the agenda is on the new business. Case number 23-5005, residential health height interpretation, I'm sorry, residential height interpretation. The request is for an appeal for the interpretation of provision of the following section of the Buren Township zoning ordinance by the Board of Zoning Appeals on the section 12.403 B1 of the zoning ordinance and section 3.106D in the R1A, R1, R2A, R1B, and R1C, single family residential district, dimensional regulations, maximum building height 30 feet, maximum building height stories 2. The request is for the interpretation is to whether the maximum allowable building height in the R1A, R2A, R1B, and R1C zoning districts is limited to 1 for both in the height in feet and the height in stories. If the maximum building height is limited only by feet, the number of stories would not be applicable, so long as the building height does not exceed the 30 feet. And now we move on to presentation A by the township staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this, and I appreciate the, there's two township residents and their design professional who are here to pay close attention to this interpretation because the request that they submitted was part of the analysis that went into this request. So in addition to variances that the BZA regularly reviews and occasionally some other similar types of requests like exceptions from the Belleville Lake Ordinance, one of the roles and responsibility of the Board of Zoning Appeals is to consider an appeal for the interpretation of a provision of the zoning ordinance under section 12.403B1 of the Buren Township zoning ordinance. For a little bit of history, this request was prompted by staff after reviewing a permit application for a new single-family detached home where the proposal, which is similar to what you see on the right side of the screen, was to have a house that is officially what would be considered 2.5 stories under the township zoning ordinance, but does not exceed the maximum allowable height of 30 feet. This is actually a permit that was previously reviewed and issued by the township's building department about 4 years ago, and that issuance has expired. Under the current zoning review, we in discussions with among staff internally, we determined that there was a potential ambiguity in the ordinance with respect to the height issue. So specifically, the R1A, R2A, R1B, and R1C single-family residential zoning districts, according to the schedule of regulations, cap building height at 30 feet or 2 stories. And the request is for a reinterpretation that in the event that the maximum building height is limited only, the request is that the maximum building height is limited only by the height in feet, and the number of stories would not be applicable so long as the building height does not exceed 30 feet. There are a number of reasons for interpreting in this regard. The first of which is because there is some ambiguity. There's been some question as to whether the 2 stories is meant to indicate full stories or perhaps partial stories or half stories would be able to be covered under anything between 2 and 3, and therefore by not capping it at 3, you could have a 2.5 story home. In interpreting based on height rather than based on the number of stories, the number of full stories, staff finds that you are maintaining sufficient standard for building height and bulk. It essentially does not matter, the presence of a dormer window or a loft in a otherwise two-story building with regard to the building's height or mass. And so in keeping with the intent of the zoning ordinance, including to regulate and limit the height and bulk of buildings and other structures, we think that this interpretation is adequate. This interpretation would also reduce the likelihood of a zoning ordinance interpretation that would render properties in the township non-conforming. You see the current permit application before us on the right side of the screen. We also have a number of properties in the township that would fall into a non-conforming category if we suddenly determined that they were capped at 2.0 stories, even if they met the height requirement. So here's a couple of just images of existing parts of these zoning districts where there is a structure that has 2.5 stories. And then finally, just a broader conversation around the township's master plan, where generally there are provisions that ask the township to consider missing middle housing formats, other layouts that are currently absent in the township. And so the objectives of the 2020 master plan for residential land uses included allowing flexibility with the way that residential buildings are constructed throughout the township. Based on these findings, I do recommend approval of the requested interpretation. And the BZA may approve this interpretation, essentially capping it based on the height, not necessarily based on 2 stories. Deny it or request additional information and postpone their decision. I do have Mr. and Mrs. Zelenka who have been waiting patiently. I don't know if they have any personal insight to add. This is a more general ordinance interpretation question, but it does have some backing in a specific permit application that they've provided. So feel free to speak if they'd like.
So I just have a general question. Did we have another variance request for the same property
Yes.
back 2 or 3 years ago?
Yes, there was a variance request for this property, and that was around the setbacks, the issue of setbacks.
Right, with the trees, right? I remember something with trees.
The trees, I do not have a good memory of that. Maybe the
That's what it is in the honest conversation. So we stand up the podium. The board of record again, please state your name and well.
Lawrence and Mary Zelenka. We're at 9109 13125 Ormond Drive. Property owners there for since the 50s. That particular presentation that Mr. Powers gave was correct. We had building permit that was granted in 2019, but what had happened, the company that was building it, their workers, this was during the time of COVID, so they had lost a bunch of workers. And we had to put everything on hold. So
what was the variance that we were requesting? One of the last.
oh yes, okay.
Well, would you put the microphone more towards you?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
This here picture of the home is not really as correct as it should be. It's an old one. The variance was for an elevator shaft.
No, this is the old one.
The old one.
Yes, because there was a variance that we needed because of the size of the lot. Okay, we could only come in so many feet. We had to have the it's not the setback. What do you call on either side of the house? East?
it is setback.
It is setback. Okay. All right. So we had to stay within that. And if I recall what the variance was, is that we were over that amount. I'm not sure, but I think that's what it was. We are not any longer in that situation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. The board is discussing. Trustee Mark.
To the chair. So what is our definition of a story? A story can be anywhere from 9 to 14 feet. So I'm kind of confused about where we're going. So if we make the height limit 30 feet, what is, well, let me go back. What's the typical height of a resident, Mr. Powell, and a two-story resident?
I'd say a 9 to 12 foot height is typical per floor.
So a two-story would be 26, 27 feet maybe. 28 feet if you use the 14-foot maximum.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate.
In the structure they want to build is going to be 30 feet.
The structure they want to build, the current plans show it as 29 feet, I believe, measured as halfway between the peak and the eave of the roof. For a typical gable roof.
So I guess the question is to determine whether you're going to use stories or 30 feet. I guess you have to first establish what an actual story is in Van Buren Township.
Yes, and there is a definition that was provided in the staff report on page 55. And there's a I can read it verbatim if you'd like, or just summarize. And there's also a definition of a half story.
Director Power?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, could I ask the director? The house that you showed with the applicant, this is not an applicant, correct? This was just an example issue that came up. You are actually making the request here, not on behalf of someone in the audience. This isn't a variance request. This is an administrative interpretation request. And if what we interpret the law as here tonight has binding force across the entirety of the residential districts of the township, this is therefore not to be taken lightly. This is not a simple variance request that stays with the property in perpetuity. This covers the entire township.
It's a clarification.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yes, that's a request.
Yep.
Yeah, so particular to this case, it's just.
This is an example.
Yeah,
This is an example.
Yeah, so I have an additional question. What is the purpose then of the restriction for 3 stories? Is that for aesthetics, functionality, all the above?
It may be all the above. It may be to reduce the possibility of sort of having multiple kind of building features, kind of have consistency across neighboring properties. You typically, if you cap it at a number of stories, then you're going to have consistency across a number of adjacent properties. So that probably is some of the intent. But broadly, you're still going to have single-story buildings next to 2-story buildings in some cases, and the height of the zoning ordinances is clearly at 30 feet. Mr. Jari has something to.
Are you done with your presentation on this?
My presentation was brief. I didn't include a staff report that you can reference.
Okay.
I guess to add to my presentation, I would say it is a general interpretation. It would apply to multiple properties. In making a decision one way or the other, you may give a condition to staff to take back for future consideration with possible ordinance review and direction to move forward with. But this is something that staff has requested as a general interpretation.
Yeah, again, this is not a site plan review. Okay,
So I may regret saying this, but is this something that the planning commission should really tackle?
Mr. Chairman, if I may. I have before I weigh in on that, I just have a couple of questions for staff. I do have an opinion as to how the ordinance should be interpreted, but I want to know from staff, how frequently do you have applicants coming in with a request for clarification about what that ordinance means or how to interpret the ordinance? How often do applicants come in and then think they know the ordinance, but then you have to tell them that's not how it's interpreted, and they have to build a 2-story house instead of a 2.5-story house?
It's infrequent. In my time here, there was one other interpretation based on the definition of a floor area in senior housing, that was more driven by a specific applicant, specific request. In this case, it was more an analysis based on a building permit reviewed by multiple staff members that we all kind of came to a consensus that there was ambiguity, so we wanted the BZA to
Okay.
provide interpretation.
My feeling on this in the name of expediting the meeting is that it's very rare for me not to agree with staff. And in this one, I don't agree that there's ambiguity. I think the ordinance is very clear. There's two ways to measure height in our ordinance. It's by feet and it's by stories. Stories are not defined in feet. They're defined by floors on top of each other. And in the maximum height column in section, I have it written down, but I won't quote it. It's that table 4102, table 2. It says the maximum height is 30 feet, 2 stories in those residential districts. If you look at the beginning of our ordinances in section 1104, 1106, the conflicting ordinances. When any two ordinances appear to be in conflict, it's the more restrictive measurement is the one that applies. And that's right there in the beginning of our ordinances. If you see two ways to measure something, the more restrictive one is the one that applies. When I first looked at this, I thought, oh, maybe they meant 2 stories, maybe 2 full stories, and it's an unspecified measurement of half stories. That's not the case. The table calls out specifically 2.5 stories in the other zones. I think it's very clear that the intent of the ordinance is for it to be 2 stories, 30 feet, whichever comes first, and that there is no ambiguity. It must be interpreted as both. As another piece of information, or as a counterexample, if we were to say that you could pick which one of those 2 measurements you wanted, we have another measurement like that in our zoning regulations, and that is side setback and sum of 2 sides setback. In residential, it's 10-foot side setback, or sum of 2 is 25. If we were to say that you were allowed to take your pick of which measurement you wanted, then someone could conceivably build a house at a zero foot side setback, as long as they had at least 25 feet on the other side. Well, that's clearly not how we interpret it in zoning and planning. It is the 2 have to be taken together, and the more restrictive of the 2 measurements apply. That said, Mr. Haas asked, isn't this something Planning Commission should consider? Yeah, this is something Planning Commission should consider. You know, the limitation on 2 stories, maybe housing trends have changed since that ordinance went in. Maybe people want to put up finished attic space with what we call them, the dormer windows, doghouse windows. Doghouse windows. Sorry. Maybe that is a change that needs to be considered. And it certainly has merit. I see the house in the example, not a bad looking house. I can see that the argument has merit, but it should be handled at the Planning Commission level. And the reason it should be handled at the Planning Commission level and not as an interpretation by the BZA, that all we can do in the BZA is make an interpretation that 2 doesn't mean 2. 2 stories doesn't mean 2 stories. That's not right. That makes for unclear ordinance. But the Planning Commission could consider a change to the ordinance in the residential districts after a public hearing, and a recommendation to the Township Board recommending that the number of stories be raised to 2.5 or 3 or whatever the study arrives at. But it should be done at the Planning Commission level, not at the BZA.
As long as there's no higher than 30 feet.
Well, you know, if we're going to reconsider things like the number of stories or the number of feet, it's possible that you might want to consider the number of feet as well. Maybe housing markets have changed, and maybe in the residential district, and some of them, a higher roof line would be more in line with current housing trends. I don't know. We haven't studied it yet. It hasn't come to the Planning Commission. But I would, as a member of the Planning Commission, certainly be willing to consider it and look at it and hear the report. But for this ordinance interpretation, I believe it's clear that the answer is both. And in the residential districts, it is the more restrictive of the 2, 30 feet or 2 stories.
I agree with that assessment. However, in the past, and I lived on Lake One Pass at one time, there are 2 homes that have what's called the third story, it's not really a third story, but most of the time it's the attic space, less than a half or about a half of a floor space that's used for game rooms or storage or closet space, that kind of thing with the dog windows. And the one on Linda Vista, that they showed on the screen, I was there as it was being built, and I've been in that as well as the ones on the Lakeshore Pass. And that has got a big game room, that's about half the size of the story. You know, what it would be called, the 2.5 or whatever you want to call it, third story. However, all the ones that are on the assessment rolls were built prior to 2000. That's 23 years ago. So my recommendation would have been to send this back to the planning commission for clarification, not to deny it, but to incorporate it into the zoning ordinance.
Would you consider, if I may,
Yes.
would you consider a recommendation, an interpretation that the height has to be both, but with a recommendation to the planning commission to consider it at their earliest possible time to consider adjusting the number of stories?
Yes,
See that.
as long as it doesn't exceed the 30 feet enough. That way you don't have to go to it. And if that's the way the planning commission wants to go, I don't know if that's your prerogative.
Certainly something that I as a planning commissioner.
Just to get these doghouse they go forward, but there won't.
The doghouse. Dormant.
Yeah. I'm not talking about the damn cave, I'm talking about the doghouse.
So an interpretation, Director Howard, is you asked, for is my interpretation, you understand my position on that?
I do, yep, that makes sense, and there will be other residential zoning ordinance amendments I think you'll see the planning commission consider in the future, but I think this one sounds like it's taking priority based on your direction, if that's the motion you want to entertain.
Okay. Any other comments? Yeah, please do.
Since, he had, Mr. Jared already mentioned before that he may take a look at the 30 people as well, so I would not put a limit on the 30 feet. If they're gonna look at it, I would make the decision on if they're gonna be able to extend over 30 feet.
So higher than 30 feet.
Correct, because he's looking at it.
If they're looking at it, yeah.
Correct, might as well take a look at it from both sides.
But including to our leads.
Yeah,
Okay, at the minimum, 2.5 stories or whatever you want to call
yeah.
it. Still out for that type of building.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
within reason. Within reason.
That would be in the planning commission at that point. If we're kicking it back to them, that would be on their call, what committee would it be?
The reason I'm saying that is because here, we're looking at houses in a neighborhood. Just focus, if you would, for a minute. If you were on the beach and you had all single-story houses, and some joker came along and built a story in a house, a story and a half. Now, you're not on the beach side, but you were on the other side of the street. Now, he's blocking your view. We need to look at this.
Well, that's the building height.
Well, and center, that's what I'm saying, within reason. When you're talking over 30 feet, it has to be within common sense reason. And there again, that's where your your ability to give a little, but not too much.
Okay.
Through the chair, I just wanted to make one point here. And I do remember this is like the first night I was on. I was a member of the BZA when I heard your case, and I remember it had to do with the setbacks, and there were trees that I remember that was part of that discussion. So I just would like to make sure that this goes along fairly quick, because it was 2019 and they still would like to roll out.
I would add that any change to a zoning ordinance where someone can make a motion to recommend the planning commission or staff to begin exploring it, that would go through the planning commission for a recommendation to the board of trustees. It's the board of trustees who has the ultimate approval. Director Power, and to address Commissioner Haas's concern, we do have an example. They're clearly in the building planning process. Not applicant, they haven't applied to the BZA for any variance yet. But is it possible that they might apply for a variance for this half a story? Given that the rule clearly says under this interpretation, 2.5 is not going to be allowed in that residential district until such time as the ordinance is changed. Would it be possible for the applicant, or would it be advisable, or for the applicant to come back with an actual formal variance to the BZA, or is that not something that staff would recommend at this time?
They certainly may. Here the recommendation is that the interpretation is no, you have to use the more restrictive standard, and therefore this house as proposed, or not with this one similar, would not meet that, and therefore if they wanted to apply right away, they could apply for a variance. We could also begin the process of having the ordinance discussion with the planning commission to change that, but based on the way the current ordinance is written and how you've all reinterpreted it tonight or interpreted it tonight, if they wanted to start applying today, you could apply for a variance to the BZA. That's certainly a possibility.
I'm not making any recommendation for that whatsoever. I'm only bringing it up as a possibility.
Yeah.
I'd like to, we're not against you, we just need to clarify our ordinance so that you do it legally, and although it's going to take a couple steps to get there, but we're trying to help you get the building to go.
Tonight, you had any questions for them?
Okay. Do we have any precedent for building size being on,
So the structure itself, if you look at 10, okay,
we are on Zoom, so they can't hear you unless you talk to the microphone, please.
okay. So basically, if we're looking at the structure of the home, what you have is a story and a half. When I had my first place demolished, the first thing that the builder said, did you ever think of building up? The light bulb turned on. Being that I've got a 50-foot wide lot, right? We went through all these plans. So the garage is about 10 feet. The next level up is 10 feet. And the loft area is 10 feet, but it's only a half a story. That's how to look at it. The outside staircase, that's not in our plans now. They have wonderful blueprints all ready to go. Our starting date was Valentine's Day. And I've been waiting a long time, so however you can help us, we appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to respond to one point Mr. Haas made about the variance that was previously considered. I do want to mention there was a significant change to the zoning ordinance that, if I recall correctly, addressed some of the aspects of that variance. So that's no longer a concern. They made some adjustments to their layout, but also the ordinance was adjusted in 2019 to reduce side yard setback distance in lakeside lots because of the issue where there are a lot of platted lots that are narrow. So
Specifically for houses on Orland Drive, where the lot sizes were set a long time ago, well, it wasn't really that long, just the 50s. So it's, we had absolutely changed some of the ordinances around there in order to allow houses that would normally be on what we consider an unbuildable lot to become buildable. And this, I think, is one of them, one of the ones that this affects. So, yeah, we definitely been working on it. Mr. Chair, does staff need a motion or a formal recommendation from us?
Yeah, I think we need to make a formal motion too. However, I have one question before we go to a motion. Was the permit ever issued for a building?
yes, there was, and it was expired.
Yes, due to code. Or
Right, it sounds like that.
was that the case?
It was like April of 2019 by Judy Fields.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So, I mean, they cannot start now for the permit that was in existence at the time, but just a renewal.
It did expire, so
It
we
expired.
look at it fresh.
Okay. All right. I just want to read this for the record that
Yeah, it's certainly valid.
it was expired and we cannot start without. Okay.
I'm sorry, last question, sir. Did it expire in 2019 or was it granted in 2019?
Permits expire if there had been no initial construction after 6 months, and then if there had been no construction after 6 months of the last inspection. So sometime during the past 3
Yeah,
years.
no expense was requested or additional time, correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, okay. All right, so we're. Yep, that's correct. All right, motion is in order.
Mr. Chairman, if it's a motion coming to the planning commission, I respectfully ask not to be looked at to make the motion.
Okay.
I'd like to make a motion.
Sure.
So I would like to make a motion, that this, hang on.
I do know.
Hang on. I need to make sure that I'm quoting the correct. So I would like to make a motion that, the issue in section 3.106D dash R1A, R2A, R1B, and R1C, single family residential district dimensional regulations, max building height 30 feet, 2 stories, be referred to the planning commission for additional clarification
And additions.
and additions.
Support.
Discussion?
Yeah, well, we don't have a second then.
Okay.
It's supported. It's a vote that is discussed, and second and for discussion.
Director Power was asking the BZA for clarification on this ordinance. It probably is not for the planning commission to provide that clarification. I think that the BZA probably needs to entertain a motion that says the issue of height, in the issue of height, both standards of measurements apply, and it is the more restrictive of the two that shall prevail. I recommend the motion.
So, through the chair, that's not what I recommend. So what I was recommending that this section be referred to the planning commission to determine how they would like to apply this. Because there may be other circumstances such as lake lots that are narrower that they may have other opinions on. So I didn't want to make it that narrow.
The reason I suggest we make it narrow in that one case is that staff is looking for an answer from the BZA as to how the law should be interpreted. Should the law be interpreted as either one of those numbers apply independently, or do both those numbers apply? I think the common interpretation, or the one that's we seem to agree on, is that both numbers must apply simultaneously. You can kick it over to the planning commission if you want to, I suppose, and we would say the same thing. But since it was issued, it was a request that was before the BZA, I think staff would probably, I won't speak for staff. Would you care is it okay if the PC makes the recommendation, or would you rather come from the BZA?
For interpretations of the zoning ordinance, that should technically come from the BZA. So that is the role of the BZA tonight. But I think to Board Member Haas's point, the planning commission is being requested to look at whether they'd be willing to see flexibility for unique types of lots or buildings.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I understand the vote.
Yeah. So there may be other circumstances, perhaps this one, right, that may be an exception to the, the most restrictive. That's why I believe the planning commission should take a much closer look at this. Because if we go ahead and we make a ruling right now, which I believe is what the building department is asking for, then it would be then the debate of, is it the most restrictive or is it one or the other? And my point is, let's send this back to the planning commission, have the planning commission take a closer look at this to see if there's other conditions that may want to be applied in a modification to the building ordinance.
I understand.
So through the chair, personally, if we're gonna go on a vote on this, I would just like to state that I personally will decline or nay to that vote, because I feel like it was brought to us to look at this particular situation. Obviously, I would like to help them out, and I'm looking at the ordinance and saying 30 feet is overall 30 feet. That's the amount of room that you're taking up and height. So rather that, person builds 2.5 floors or builds 3 floors at 10 feet, overall, your overall capacity on that building is still 30 feet. So I personally would like to see a motion to approve or to look at the current situation and decide on the fact if we say it's restricted at 30 or 2.5 feet. And I personally would say it's 30 feet. That's what I would like to do to try to help them move forward.
So your proposal is to allow 30 feet and have them build.
That is mine.
That's your intent of the motion.
That is my intent of the motion. And then going forward.
So the applicant, it's a particular case and the applicant proceed with.
Well, yeah, but also for the whole township.
Yeah.
Right? So if we're making a judgment on the whole township, then absolutely kick it to PC for further review. But I think we're here tonight to determine how are we going to measure a building? Is it 30 feet, 2.5 stories, 30 feet, 2 stories? I mean, so at that point, I say we vote on what was brought in front of us and how do we feel ordinance and the ordinance states. I personally feel that the ordinance states it's 30 feet. And if you can do 3 stories and 30 feet, your overall mapping is 30 feet. So
I agree 100% with that. 30 feet is 30 feet, and it's more, it could be mentioned to them. That might be what they want, but if it's 30 feet, it's still 30 feet. So,
Through the chair.
Yes.
This comes back to what I stated earlier, as far as what is a story. I can build a 2-story, 30-foot home. And I build a 1-story, 30-foot home.
Yes, you can.
Sure you can.
But I can't build a 2.5-story, 30-foot home.
Well, that's the request.
but according to the ordinance now, how do we interpret it?
So our interpretation of what we design is going to change the building code, basically.
It'll change the interpretation of the law without having planning commission recommendation to the board of trustees and without the board of trustees voting on the ordinance change.
Right, that's why I'm not inclined to. I think we need to look a little more research on it before we can bring the decision. I can't bring the decision. It's going to impact many residences and future building permits.
But through the chair, it's going to impact, but how's the impact affect our community? I mean, look at the homes that they use in reference. I mean, the homes that they use in reference, great looking homes. The homes that they're using in reference for the building plans, beautiful home. So, I mean, at the end of the day, 30 feet, 30 feet, I would much rather be next to a 2.5-story, 3-story home that's 30 feet versus a 30-foot single-story home. I think a 30-foot single-story home may look awkward or weird compared to speaking to a 3-story, 30-foot home. So, I mean, I don't know. I guess I would disagree.
I feel you, Mr. Sullivan. I get what you're saying, but I'm just saying that this is a lot bigger than a single request for a.
And that's why we're here.
For a ruling and interpretation of this ruling. I really don't know.
Just for the record, it's our job.
That's right.
We're charged with interpreting this, and that's why before.
That's
So it's in our realm to make a decision and do so today.
Mr. Chair,
So although it will be president. So.
I would be very happy at this time to entertain a motion that the interpretation of the statute, the ordinance, shall be the traditional interpretation. Both numbers must be considered simultaneously. And that the planning commission shall, at its next available opportunity, consider the issue of increasing the story count from 2 to a higher number.
So through the chair,
Yeah, as long as it doesn't exceed 30 feet, is that what you propose?
If you would like to so amend the motion, I.
No.
To it.
I'm just asking, was that for?
so through the chair, I would like to agree with you except for the opposite. Meaning that I would agree that it's one or the other, and then refer to the planning commission. So meaning that we would agree that it's 30 feet regardless of stories, 30 feet, or the number of stories. And in this case, it would be 30 feet, and then send it over to the planning commission.
And through the chair, I would support that.
Okay.
Through the chair.
Yes.
I believe that once we make a decision on it, it's moved after that, the planning commission.
They don't need to go, but they can look at it.
Then it'd be another ordinance change if they decide they want to do something else. So our decision is binding and it's gonna be township wide, so just bringing that point up.
Can I ask him to just elaborate on that a little bit? So, if I'm understanding what you're saying is that we go ahead and we pass this is binding, correct? And agree with that. However, if the planning commission decides to change the ordinance, right, then it becomes a new ordinance at that point.
Yeah, then you have to go through the whole process of the ordinance, right, the ordinance is going to.
Approvals. Planning commission doesn't
Everything
change
you
ordinances.
No, but they can recommend it and just brought before the township board and they decide.
So just to add on that, the concern is that we would go ahead and we would agree to something that would have an impact before, a greater impact, before the planning commission could come to a decision on changing the ordinance then.
Right, or they may decide not to change.
So are we beyond the discussion stage? All right,
You take the motion, please, somebody.
I believe it was my motion. My motion was to interpret the ordinance in the traditional way, that the way spelled out by section. By the section, what is it, 101, 106, 1.106?
3.106.
Yes, the traditional interpretation as determined by section 1.106 shall be applied to the matter of building height, that both measurements shall be taken into consideration, and the more restrictive of the two numbers shall prevail as required by Article 1.106.
Yeah.
I think it's 1.106. And that the zoning board of appeals requests that the planning commission consider the issue of story limitation, increasing it at their next available opportunity. Hope that was clear.
is there support for that motion?
Can I ask a question before?
Yeah, sure.
So through the chair, to staff, if Mr. Jar's motion was accepted, right, which would make this property non-compliance, could they come back then and ask for a variance?
Yes, they could do that right away. In the interim, well, presumably there's an ordinance discussion.
And then through the chair, we would be delaying them at least 30 days. And on top of that, setting a new precedent by making an exemption to what's already in front of us today. Okay.
Well, we have a motion on the floor, but we have no second. Oh, no, I correct it, in the second. Any discussion on the motion on the floor? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. No, wait a minute, let me go back to the floor. No.
Amos Brissette,
Yes.
trustee Kevin Martin,
Yes.
John Haas,
No.
Aaron Sellers,
No.
Jeffrey Jar.
Yes.
We have a tie.
So,
It means we can't make a decision that doesn't fail, correct?
That's,
So that
that's
means the
correct.
motion fails.
the motion fails. A tie fails, period.
Through the chair, so it means we can't make a decision, which means they have to come back next month.
That's correct.
Does not fail.
Okay.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I think it's.
Aye, fails.
Yep. Any public hearing or any public meeting I've ever attended.
Through the chair,
Tie fails.
the township stated the last time
Yeah,
in the break with the BYC that that's not the case, that it's a tie, and the decision cannot be made, and that it would be essentially up.
yeah, I did do this, but.
Yeah, yes, I guess
Yeah, but we postponed that one.
to clarify, this motion failing means that there is no consensus among the BZA as to whether the more stringent or less stringent standard applies. But I think in fairness, there's a lot of good feedback from tonight's meeting to allow staff the direction to at least start the, if there's a consensus by the board, to at least start the ordinance discussion with the planning commission and to allow the applicant the opportunity to apply for a variance on the premise that their ordinance more stringent ordinance, we can start that process. I don't see any issue with that.
It is my intent to help the applicant do what other people have done. And we need a process to make that happen. That's the reason why I voted no, because I want to help the applicant. Everybody else up until now has been able to do what they want to do. As long as that everything else falls in place, according to the bylaws, site plan, et cetera. That's the reason I'm gonna help them out. They've already waited 4 years. So, whatever the speedy process is the way I'd like to go.
So what you're asking then is that we give you direction to go back and work with the applicant on a variance for the next meeting, as well as start discussions with the planning commission?
I think that would be an acceptable outcome.
I would support that.
Okay.
Or we go back with the applicant, work with them, to have their issue.
Should have done it in the speedy process. That's my goal. They're not trying to do anything else. They just want to. So, that's our job, and we need to take our responsibility. Okay. So where do you go from here? From here. We have a motion that ties, so.
Yeah.
Are we directing staff to go back and work with the applicant and to get this done?
So I'd like to make a motion.
Sure. Motion is in order.
Okay. So I would like to make a motion that we direct staff to go back and work with the applicant on a variance for section 3106D of the single family residential district dimensional regulations. And furthermore, have staff start working with the planning commission on the same stated regulation.
Clarifying the ordinance.
Clarifying the ordinance.
Support.
All right, is the motion is supported? Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. Opposed, likewise. Do we need roll call? No? No, we voted in the affirmative, so I think I'm fine. All right. Good luck, folks. We're trying to help you.
We'll move things forward.
I have no other, agenda items other than. Anything from staff?
Just thank you for your hard work in a very long meeting. You've had 2 in 2023, so appreciate it. I anticipate we're meeting next month.
I like to take this job seriously. We're here to serve without hindrance. Okay, anybody else with any comments? With that, you have a comment? Sure. Okay, motion to adjourn. Not debatable. Any second? One favor, say aye. PM.
Yes.
How many people are supposed to be on the BZA?
You don't. We're supposed to have 7 regular members and 2 alternates.
Thank you, everybody.
I'm missing a regular member.
We're missing Mr. Rock.
No, I counted him.
He was excused.
Yes.
See, my alternate though.
He, that may be a typo because I believe when he got reappointed, he was appointed to regular. I'll check on that. But we are supposed to have 2 alternates.
So I thought we had 7, we had an alternate, and we had a planning commission.
All over there.
They're all over there now?
They used to be
The
on
planning
this
commission alternate is.
It's a voting member.
The alternate is a regular.
Yeah, yes, one of the planning commissioners is also a regular voting member.
Yeah, Mr. Jar.
Yes.
Yes, whichever one of the 2 planning commission reps is sitting on the bench gets to vote, the other one gets to.
I understand. I'm saying we're short on it. Well, you say Barack's supposed to be a
Yep,
regular member, not an alternate.
that's right. So we're actually missing our 2 alternates. The wording gets confusing because there's a primary and an alternate, or primary and secondary planning commission.
These are difficult meetings, folks. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. I appreciate that.
Always.
Yeah,
We are.